So we're going to now hear from Anna Zobnina. She's from Russia. She's born in St. Petersburg, Russia, and currently lives in Scotland. She's policy coordinator for European Network of Migrant Women. She's going to give some feedback on the new book and some general thoughts. So welcome, Anna, and over to you.
It is not easy for me to respond to a new piece of work and a book written by someone as big, as prominent, as pioneering and visionary as Janice Raymond. And I have to say that I was a little surprised with the invitation to respond to the book, as it is very obvious to me that a lot of women, including many women in this webinar today, with many more years of experience and much more knowledge, would be perhaps better placed to give a response and review of the new book of Janice Raymond. For me, it is important to acknowledge that and to also recognize that my understanding and my reading and the feedback to the book comes from my specific experience that has been shaped in the areas of work where I'm engaged. And one of them is known as a policy work, but also my focus of my work with migrant and refugee women, and the area of advocacy for the abolition of prostitution and male violence in general. So it is these experiences that give me a specific outlook on individuals who work in the NGO world and academia that often overlaps with the NGO world and the policy sector at the European and some extent international level. And because of my personal exposure to these environments of policy world, NGO, and academia, I have come to place a very specific value in the qualities of moral integrity and intellectual coherence, which are a rare sight in those environments. I think at a very basic human level, it is difficult enough to maintain those qualities for anyone. It is much more difficult to maintain them when you are an academic, when you are involved in managing a large international human rights organization. And it is also very challenging to maintain them when, in the eyes of the common people, you belong to a movement that calls itself feminism. I'm saying this because in these environments, it is not uncommon, in my experience, for women to lose sight of priorities, to be swayed by public opinion or pressure groups, to compromise in order to sustain one's organization or one's career, or make some very pragmatic choices to survive. And I'm saying this because for me, Janice Raymond and her intellectual and academic work, her policy work, and her activism as well, represent this kind of integrity, coherence, and consistency over a considerable period of time. In the Doublethink, Janice Raymond says, this book is not the Transsexual Empire #2, but it could not have been written without #1. And for me, it feels like knowing Janice's work and the qualities of her work, including a huge amount of work done to abolish the system of prostitution and male violence. So knowing this, I would say as well that how I feel about this book, that the transsexual empire, #1, could not have been without this book, The Doublethink, that came kind of complete the cycle that Janice opened with the publication of Transsexual Empire. Again, in The Doublethink, Janice says, in 1979, I wrote that men cannot become women or women men. I personally found it always very interesting to note that the publication of Transsexual Empire coincided with the adoption of CEDAW Convention. It's the same time period, 78, 79, 80s, the early 80s. And CEDAW is known as the International Bill on women's rights and the only international convention that sets in writing the standards for substantive equality for women and protection of women from sex-based discrimination. Now, of course, those standards could be much higher. We all know that. We know that CEDAW is not very strong on violence against women, for example, but whether we like it or not, this is the only international instrument right now that protects women from discrimination done against us because we are women. So I also can't not notice that it is the same year, 1978, when I was born. So for me, those two publications, Transsexual Empire and the adoption of CEDAW, they quite literally mark my birth. So that's my entire lifespan. And for me, thinking retrospectively, it is fascinating and terrifying to look where we are as women's rights movement globally today, how much of what was said in the first book of Janice has become reality, and how much said in CEDAW has become a kind of fantasy. Not everything, but quite a lot of it. And where the whole international discussions on the standards of women's rights have moved. Janice again writes, looking ahead from 1979, I envisioned that the few university and hospital-based gender identity centers treating adult transsexuals would grow and become sex role control centers for female and male children who deviated from traditional sex roles. And this is exactly where we are today. We are in crisis. Speaking more about the book itself, and I think Janice makes it very clear in the introductory parts that the book has it has two dimensions or two types of readerships, if you want. So one of them, how I saw it, is the feminists themselves, of course, those women who have been actively involved in protecting women and girls' rights, protecting women and girls from being erased from law, language, whether they're radical feminists or abolitionist feminists or gender critical feminists. A lot of them will find themselves in the book. So for this kind of readership of informed women, the book offers, I think, a number of important and I would say much weighted clarifications. For example, the position and the analysis and the speculations around it of Andrea Dworkin on the issue of transgenderism. It also points out very clearly at some of the traps in which it is very easy to be caught for a number of reasons, such as the demand for the feminists to differentiate between the extremists and the moderate majority of the trans movement. It also points out at the danger of idealizing those few individuals, both men and women, who identify as transgender, but not the opposite sex. And they are critical of both self-declaration of sex and trans movement. On this, Janice says in the book, I welcome the perspective of those trans-identified women or men who recognize the dangers of self-declaration. I appreciate the public statements they make, but I also question why some gender-critical trans-identified persons do not recognize and discuss their own supporting roles in generating this current trans movement. I also appreciate Janice's honesty and her rigorous approach to language, and her clarification that she will not use in this book the required pronouns. And at the same time, this book offers a very thorough documentation of what has been happening, mostly in Anglophone world, which is important because all of this came from the Anglophone world in the first place. And it pays a tribute to radical feminists, to radical feminist analysis and thought, and gives a pan-Arabic view. And as I said, a thorough documentation of diverse and crucial areas in which women's rights and human rights in general are being impacted and eroded. It also speaks about the masses of work done by women, by feminists, by radical feminists to oppose this attack on women's rights, and the impact that these women, most of whom are radical feminists, have sustained while continuing their work. So I think this book is an important reminder and an exercise in maintaining the integrity, the coherence, intellectual honesty, while very importantly, giving credit to the women for their work. So as such, I think it's a wonderful gift to the community, to the feminist community. At another level, and again, Janice makes it clear that this book is not only for radical feminists, and I hope that it will not be only for radical feminists, and it should be and hopefully will be read by ordinary women and perhaps some men and girls and general public who may not be familiar with a lot of what is going on in this field. And in this sense, I think the book can be grouped together with a number of other publications. I won't name them, but we all know that there have been several books published recently on the subject of transgender activism and ideology and impact on women's rights or freedom of speech. And for those readers, the book offers, again, the documentation, the mappings of abuses and tactics in the area of girls and women's basic rights to safety, bodily integrity, media, including social media, legal, educational, sport, medical, academic sectors, freedom of speech and assembly. But of course, I have to say that this book is very different from other publications because it is written by an expert who was the pioneer in this area. It is written by a woman who dedicated her entire career and her life to defend women and girls from male violence, in particular sexual violence. It is written by a person with extensive experience working internationally, a teacher, an academic, a writer, who has applied her work beyond academia, beyond raising awareness and organizing conferences, but also coordinating and working on the programs from which the most discriminated women have benefited in concrete terms. And as Janice says herself, one of the goals of this book is to amplify the voices of women who have been harmed by the doublethink of transgenderism and to recognize them as survivors of male sexual violence, many of whom identified as trans men, gender non-binary, or queer. This will be my general feedback to the book. And I know that Janice writes, she says that at the time when book burning continues, as I write, and she wonders if the doublethink will be another victim relegated to the index of forbidden books, a list historically banned by Roman Catholic Church. And yes, we know it will be. And I hope we're all ready to make it more difficult for the new church of transgender ideology to burn this book, to ban this book, and to invisibilize this. Thank you.